This is Lake George, near Canberra, and this rest area remembers a quite extraordinary man named Charles Groves Wright Anderson. One unique claim to fame he could make was that he won medals in both World Wars. Born in South Africa, he received a military cross during the First World War, serving with the King's African Rifles. He emigrated to Australia between the wars, and soon after the outbreak of World War II, he joined the Australian Army. In 1941, he sailed to Malaya, a lieutenant colonel, in command of the 2nd 19th Battalion. That makes Charles Groves Wright Anderson Australia's highest ranking recipient of the VC. Anderson was the only Australian to be awarded a Victoria Cross in Malaya when, just before his 45th birthday, he was in action at the Mwar River. Later, the Japanese Commander-in-Chief, General Yamashita, was to record in his diary that the Battle of Mwar was the most savage of the whole campaign. In all fairness, survivors of the enemy forces can feel proud because in a week-long bloody battle without tank or air support, they held up the whole of my army.
He is an inspiring leader, and he has temporary command of a brigade that's basically cut off by the Japanese. You know, it really becomes a case where he has to give the order, every man for himself. And but in the process, he's actually leading the fighting. You know, he's charging Japanese roadblocks himself. He's very inspirational. But many men are killed. Those that survive become prisoners of war of the Japanese, and they endure that long captivity, of which he becomes part.
Anderson's leadership did not end with defeat in Malaya. Rather, it grew in stature in Japanese captivity, where, on the Burma-Thailand Railway, he repeatedly defied the Japanese and suffered beatings in defence of the rights and welfare of his men. Anderson survived the war and died on Armistice Day, 1988, at the age of 91. But over 8,000 Australians didn't survive at the hands of the Japanese. And one of them is remembered by a very simple rest area on the border of the Australian Capital Territory. William Ellis Bill Newton was born in St Kilda, was a notable sportsman, and was the third Australian to be awarded a Second World War VC as a flyer, but the only one who was serving with the Royal Australian Air Force. Bill Newton served in New Guinea from the middle of 1942. His citation applauded his great courage during 10 months of operational flying, but his award was given particularly for his final sortie on the 16th of March 1943.
His aircraft was hit and it burst into flames. Flight Lieutenant Newton saw it as his duty to keep the aircraft in the air and to take his crew as far away as possible from the enemy's positions. With great skill, he brought his blazing aircraft down on the water.
Bill Newton survived the crash and was captured by the Japanese. His fate was described in the diary of a Japanese serviceman. The prisoner is made to kneel on the bank of a bomb crater. He is apparently resigned. The precaution has been taken of surrounding him with guards with fixed bayonets, but he remains calm. Unit Commander Kamai taps the prisoner's neck lightly with the back of his sword, then raises it above his head with both arms and brings it down with a sweep. Bill Newton was 23 years old. Commander Kamai was killed in action shortly after the execution. Admiral Fujita, who'd ordered the killing, committed suicide following his capture.
So the Japanese, having taken all this territory, having grabbed this vast empire, have to decide what to do next.
They hadn't previously been beaten in the Pacific. They hadn't been beaten in Malaya. They hadn't been beaten in Indonesia. All these places had fallen to the Japanese, and there was a myth of their invincibility, that they couldn't be stopped.
On the 21st of July 1942, the Japanese landed at Gona in New Guinea and began to push across the Owen Stanleys towards Moresby. they pushed past Kokoda on the track across the mountains before being checked, held and forced back in one of their first land reversals of the war.
The loss of Kokoda, or at least the loss of that campaign, would have meant virtually the fall of Port Moresby and thus the loss of that entire part of New Guinea. It would have left us with no offshore defences, so we would have been basically open to Japanese attack, particularly from the air.
We know now that they weren't going to invade Australia. They weren't going to invade Australia, but they were very concerned to prevent Australia being used as the base for a counter-offensive against them.
Bruce Kingsbury was awarded the only VC of the Kokoda campaign. Kingsbury's platoon had been badly cut about and he immediately volunteered to join another which had been ordered to counterattack. The unit diary records that Number 9 platoon was used to beat back the enemy, and it was during this attack that Private Kingsbury showed outstanding courage. His fellow soldiers recalled he charged forward shouting, "Follow me, we can turn them back." Now, his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Roden, was in no doubt what that courage meant.
If he hadn't stopped them, it would have been like water pouring through a hole in a dam wall. The 25th Brigade was still in the water, and the 16th Brigade was still in Australia. Without Kingsbury, the Japanese would have been waiting for them in Moresby.
Bruce Steele Kingsbury was 24 years old. It's hard to imagine standing in this beautiful little stand of trees what these men went through again and again. It's the physical endurance as much as the courage that takes your breath away. Firing his Bren gun from his hip, continuing to sweep enemy positions. Now this is in the jungle, in tropical heat, under heavy fire, firing a gun that weighs over 10 kilos.
You are probably hot, or cold, or wet, or miserable. You probably haven't slept very well. You're probably starving because you haven't eaten very well. And yet you've got this really high level of stress because people are going to be trying to kill you. So you've got all these things compromising somebody's well-being to start with. In fact, there's probably some sort of adrenaline rush as well. A standard old fight and flight fear response. It's an automatic response. Clotting agent goes through into your bloodstream so that if you get wounded then you don't bleed out. Your reproductive system shuts down. Your digestive system shuts down because you don't need energy in those areas. The great thing there is you mobilised all the different energy and stores, you're focused on the threat and you're much more likely to either be able to combat it and win or shoot through the other way and get out of danger.
What science tells us the human body can achieve under stress doesn't really help us understand the exploits of Albert Chown. Not quite the image of a Superman, but by the time he arrives in New Guinea and enters our story, Bert Chown has been at Tobruk and fought at El Alamein. An officer who knew him remarked that Bert, with his energy, drive and courage, became a byword to us all. Once, reconnoitring an apparently abandoned Japanese camp, he found that a Japanese was standing next to him. "So," Bert reported, "I was compelled to shoot him. I then withdrew." The history of his unit records that those who knew him best felt sure he'd end up with either a Victoria Cross or a white wooden cross. In the end, he got both.
Without awaiting orders, Lieutenant Chown instantly appreciated the plight of the leading platoon and rushed the enemy's position. He hurled grenades which knocked out 2 enemy light machine guns. Then, calling on his men to follow him and firing his submachine gun from the hip, he charged the enemy's position. Although he sustained 2 serious wounds in the chest, Lieutenant Chown accounted for 2 more Japanese before he was killed, standing over 3 foxholes occupied by the enemy.
Bert Chown is amongst almost 2,400 buried at the Lay War Cemetery, New Guinea. His father said, "It's good that he got the Victoria Cross, but I wish he'd just come home instead."